the slides. Hold on. And today we are trying a new crew out for our computer systems. As hopefully everyone knows, Elaine Dewan has retired, and Joe Eaker is taking her place. So Joe is training a new crew. Joe is usually our go-to man for all the computer-related issues for our webinar. And so today is a new test session, and I think we're doing an excellent job. But Anthony is at the controls, and he's taking us through today. So just wanted to welcome everyone to today's webinar for characterization of contaminated groundwater discharge to surface water. My name is George Nicholas. I will be your moderator. My job as moderator is to try to keep today's session moving along. I also will facilitate the question and answer period and try to troubleshoot any problems that we have, and hopefully there will be none.
George, we're getting some more copies.
Okay, Tessie said there is a problem already. That is that we're a little bit short on copies for in-room attendees, and we will be fixing that problem shortly. The next is the fact that this is off, I'm sure. Okay. Oh, back. So I wanted to welcome everyone, in-person attendees. In the room, at least registered, we have over 100 people, which is great. We certainly appreciate you guys coming into marvelous downtown Trenton. We also have on the webinar over 225 people registered, and usually we get a few more. So we do have a significant webinar attendance. Just so everyone on the webinar, I think in case you joined a little bit late, I did announce that all of today's handouts are available on your dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen. You can download those. In the past, we had sent them out to you via email. But a new advancement in our webinar procedures has allowed us to post them. So that's a slightly different procedure for you guys on the web. So I wanted to talk a little bit about continuing education credits. We have applied for 2.5 regulatory CECs for today's program. In order to receive those regulatory CECs, if you are interested in them, all people who registered on the LSRPA website should have indicated that they were interested in receiving a certificate for that. And for in-house attendees, you must sign in and sign out. That's very important. So hopefully everyone did sign in. And I would encourage you to make sure that you do sign out. That is how we document attendance, and that is required by the board for us to issue CECs for this class. For webinar participants, we track your registration. We know when you are on and when you have logged out. We track your attendance in that way. And in addition to that, we have randomly inserted test quiz questions within the presentation, and webinar participants are required to answer at least 3 of the 4 test questions that we have pop up. After today's training, what will happen is that the DEP will make sure that we have an eligible or a list of eligible participants for CECs. What we do is that we take that list and we issue an email to everyone who wanted to receive a certificate for today's training and receive CECs. And the email that we send out will provide a link to the LSRP webpage. The LSRPA provides a service in which they not only register people for this particular course, but they also help issue the CEC certificates. They charge a $25 processing fee for that, but what you would do would be given a link to the LSRPA webpage, and then it's up to you to go to that link to pay the fee, and then they will issue a certificate. This is an example of what the test questions or the quiz questions that will pop up randomly throughout today's presentation. The idea is that webinar participants are encouraged to pay special attention to these because you must answer these. Once they pop up, Anthony will also put up open it up for the webinar participants who must answer the question, and then we will close it. We have a maximum of a minute for that to occur, just so that we keep the program moving, so make sure that you don't delay on the webinar in answering those questions. These are important reminders. Again, please mute your cell phones. We certainly appreciate that. If you do get a cell phone call or you do have a conversation within the room, we ask you also to take that outside the room. And we would ask just for courtesy, if you would enter and exit the room via the door to my right. That just helps with the noise level. The back doors are very noisy when they open and close. We would certainly appreciate your participation with that. And also for questions and answers. There will be question and answer periods after most of the presenters. Some it's after 2 presenters just to keep the program moving. But we would ask for everyone in the room to wait for a microphone to be brought around. It's important that the people on the webinar also hear the question as well as the answer. And that is it for webinar participants. We will open up the question and answer period, which will allow you to be able to type in questions at that time. In between the presentations, that will be closed, and that's just so that we can manage the questions better. So once it opens, feel free to type in your questions, and we will try to get to them. We'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. We find that to be a very beneficial aspect of the training, especially for people who come back later. We do record these sessions, and we post them on the training webpage of the SRP website. You are welcome to go back and review that at any time, and I think that's also a beneficial aspect of our training program. So that's it as far as the introductions, and just to give everyone an idea of how we run the sessions. What I'm going to do right now before we start is provide a short update, a briefing on technical guidance. I'm the chairperson for the development of technical guidance for the SRP program, and I would just like to give you an idea of what our status is right now. The feedback we've gotten in a lot of our training evaluation forms, and that reminds me, our training evaluation form, I hope everyone picked one up at the desk when you signed in, and also people please download that on the right-hand side of the webinar webpage or webinar desktop. What we'd ask you to do is please fill that in as we go along. We have all the presenters listed. Just give us an idea of how we're doing. We would like to improve our effectiveness each training program we give, and the way we do that is we get a lot of your feedback and we make changes, and so we would ask your help in helping us make these training presentations better. So for the technical guidance update, we've been asked to make those a little bit shorter, and I'm going to make them shorter right now. So for technical guidance, currently we have 23 technical guidance documents that have been completed, and they are posted on the guidance library of the SRP website, and the address is right there if you do want to access them. There are 6 that are currently still in development. These are the round 1 technical guidance committees that started in 2010, I believe, and we had quite a few of those. These guidance documents are all completed. This just gives you an idea that a lot of them have been revised already. If you go to the guidance library, you can tell whether a guidance document has been revised by looking. Once you access the document, it'll tell you what version it is, and it'll tell you the date that it was issued. So if you have an older version of that, you want to make sure to use the most updated and recent guidance, and that is how you would find out whether it is. These are the rest of the round 1 technical guidance documents that are all posted on the webpage. Now these are the round 2 technical guidance committees, and as you see, we have 4 that have completed their guidance documents. First 2, capping and offsite source, have already completed their training. Groundwater discharge of surface waters training is today, and the pesticides training will be on Thursday, March 3rd. The remaining committees, commingled plume and performance monitoring, we're estimating that those documents will be issued draft in March for commingled plume, and performance monitoring in April. EPH protocol and ARS ingestion and dermal, they were guidance committees that were created to assist with the remediation standards. We estimate them, we have a target date of March, but the drop dead date for those because of the legislation that should be coming out in January is December of 2016 for those 2 documents. Other ongoing updates for technical guidance are happening to support the remediation standards. Is the vapor intrusion technical guidance, which is a huge document. John Boyer is the committee chair for that. He's doing a great job trying to get this document updated. And the last time I checked in, they were actually moving along very quickly on that document, and probably hope to get that completed in the next month or so, maybe 2 months. So impacted groundwater documents. There's quite a few documents that are being updated in response to the remediation standards. There actually can be found on the bottom. I have the bottom of this slide is the web address for the Soil and Remediation Standards webpage, and that's where all these documents can be found, the guidance documents. That's the SPLP, sea soil, soil water partitioning equation guidance, and also the sea soil A2 123D. Other technical guidance documents that have been updated in 2015, that's a eco guidance, the fill guidance, the landfills guidance actually has been updated and will be updated again. That is pending. It probably will be posted in the next week, maybe 2 weeks, depending upon how busy some of our management is in reviewing that in order to get posted. Also, the soils SIRA, that was revised in March of 2015, and the preliminary assessment guidance as well was updated. So that's it as far as a technical guidance update. Do we have any questions in regard to technical guidance? It's not usually that complicated. Good, I like that. Right now I'm going to introduce Scott Drew. Scott's going to give us an update just on the LSRPA and a little bit more information. Scott?
Thanks, George. Good morning. Great, thank you. I'm Scott Drew with Geosyntec Consultants, but I'm also a member of the Board of Trustees of the LSRPA. For the next couple of minutes, I'll be playing the role of Dan Toder, who heads up our education program, has done an excellent job in the last few years doing this. And usually in these training sessions, he gives is given a couple of minutes to talk about the LSRPA. The mission of the LSRPA, of course, is to further the profession of being an LSRP, and we do this primarily through providing technical resources and technical training to LSRPs and to help them in such issues as standard of care, applying professional judgment, and in general playing their role in protecting the environment, health, safety, and the citizens of New Jersey. We do this in a number of ways, and in particular, we're very thankful for the support we get from not only our membership but from our sponsors. We are involved in a lot of activities. Wouldn't be possible without the sponsorship that we get, and just want to take a moment and thank these people. One thing I want to mention that we're particularly proud of in the last year is the development of the LSRPA Foundation, which is now set up and awards scholarships to college students in New Jersey who are headed for careers in the environmental field. It's a terrific program and again, helped by sponsorship. Just a quick recap of the requirements for LSRPs in regards to continuing education. Again, 36 credits over a 3-year period, 3 continuing ed credits in an ethics course, which actually there's going to be 2 opportunities, I believe, to take an ethics course this year if you haven't done it yet. 10 CECs in a regulatory arena, 14 technical, and then 9 that are discretionary and can be used among any of those other categories. An important development that everyone should be aware of, certainly LSRPs, is that the board, the LSRP board, has now promulgated rules under Chapter 26I, and you should be aware of that, but within the rules there are now definitions for programs involving continuing ed credits. Note the term program, which is defines a continuing ed class and the types of credits that you can get. Also, the new term alternative verifiable learning formats is introduced. This is essentially webinars, and there are some rules involved in how to obtain credits through webinars. George mentioned the particular aspect of taking a quiz during the presentation. So, and then there's also an opportunity to get continuing ed credits through various activities, publishing a paper, giving presentations, other sorts of things where you can apply to the board for continuing ed credits. Just quickly, anybody who would like to is certainly welcome to get involved with the LSRP. We have a number of committees. We're doing a number of important works. I actually find that working on these technical guidance documents is a really important part of the process, and we certainly appreciate DEP's willingness to form these stakeholder groups and develop technical guidance to be used by LSRPs. Finally, some upcoming events. The 25th, there is a dinner meeting that will have a presentation eligible for CECs by Jim Peterson on borehole geophysics. I've seen that talk. It's excellent. March 1st and 2nd, there is a program for QA/QC. It's a 2-day program, involves 13 technical CECs, so if you need them, that's a great opportunity. There's an ethics class scheduled for the end of the month, end of March at Montclair, I'm sorry, March 8th at Montclair State. And again, those 3 ethics courses are required every 3 years. We have the LSRPA runs business breakfasts, which is an opportunity for LSRPs and others to get together and simply talk about issues they're dealing with. Really a terrific program, and I'd encourage you to attend those as well. Later in the month, there will be training on child care regulations and the developing guidance for working with child care centers as receptors. And then finally, there's going to be another remedial action permit training program May 18th. So you can visit our website and take a look at those activities, and please feel free to get involved. One other thing I thought of this morning that I wanted to add is at my firm, we always start meetings with a health and safety moment. And I think in particular with this subject area of working in and around water bodies, it's important to just take a minute to think about some of the safety issues involved in this work. So obviously, personal flotation devices are something you should consider every time you're not just working on the water, but around the water. Access through marshes and other sorts of areas provide opportunities for health and safety issues associated with footing, and certainly you want to be careful in those situations. Also brings up boating safety. If you're involved in taking surface water samples, you need to be aware of issues associated with boating, not just things like weight distribution in the boat. If you're taking core samples and you're placing some heavy object over the side, you have to be aware of how things are distributed in the boat for safety purposes. Clearly, a lot of the waterways of New Jersey are busy with commercial traffic. You have to be aware of boat wakes and other sorts of issues. You have to be particularly aware of the weather while you're doing sampling and so forth. And a number of other things such as obstructions on the bottom of rivers and so forth that might entangle various equipment that you're using, and also the presence of utilities. So just some thoughts to keep in mind as you develop your health and safety programs. Your health and safety plan is required by the tech rule, and make sure that you're safe out there as you're implementing these techniques and strategies that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Scott will be back as a presenter, presenting case studies at the end of today's training session. But today, right now, I'd like to introduce Tessie Fields and Ann Hayton. They're going to be covering clarification in regard to investigating impacts to surface water. Tessie?
Good morning. Now that you know who I am, Tessie Fields. I work with George on, thank you. Work with George on training. We also have an awesome training committee. And I want to add a couple things before Ann Hayden gets up to do the bulk of this, this part of the talk. And she's going to talk about the listserv that was sent in late November. But in preparation for today's training, I had a moment to think a little bit about why we do training. And I thought I would share that. We put a lot of thought and energy into the topics and into the substance of our training events. We listen to LSRPs, and I was talking to some people in the back, and I think you know that we do. So if you have any ideas, have any thoughts about what we can provide to help you do your job, please let us know. To that end, on the evaluation form that George talked about, there's a place to put your ideas for further training. So please use that. And if you don't have it today, you have it another time, you know how to get in touch with us to let us know what would be beneficial to you. Let's see. So often we provide new information about technical or administrative requirements, and we all recognize that the administrative requirements of this program are huge, and we are trying to be sensitive to that and give you what you need. We also do prerequisite training for people who are preparing to take the exam. We do that at Rutgers. This is the case study training, and we do that 2 times a year, in the spring and the fall. So if you're planning on taking the exam anytime, be aware to apply and get into those classes in enough time to make your application. Those classes usually fill up, so that you will be put on a waiting list if you don't get there in time, and we'll have to wait until the next class. We also do training on to clarify existing guidance or regulatory requirements. One of the things that you will hear about today is the annual ECO training that Nancy Hamill and friends do at Rutgers. I have some of the Rutgers brochures here today, and I think as you go through this, there might be some ECO experts in the room, and this is all good, but there's a lot of people who are not ECO experts. So this kind of course is really, really essential to understanding what needs to be done. So we also do training, and those of you who have come to the case study training know that we do this, is that when we do training on things when we see issues. Now you see the little parens around issues, and I'm doing air quotes. That means problems. When we're seeing people getting things wrong, when we're seeing people forgetting things, where things are being overlooked or anything like that. So that's sort of one of the reasons that this listserv went out, and one of the reasons that we're doing this today. Also, after that went out, and Nancy got requests to speak at some other venue, and so that also tells us that people want more information. So that's why we put this together today. Okay, everybody should know this. What's DEP's process and review process? Okay, everybody knows the documents all go to BCANE. BCANE sees that they're administratively complete. Do they have all the components they need? Then it goes to inspection and review, and we have a number of people from an inspection review in the room today, and they can tell. You feel free to talk to them after the training today, but they're the ones who first the documents are inspected. There are inspectors in this group. They look at the forms, they look at what was submitted, and they decide if it needs further review. Sometimes when they do these reviews, these inspections, is they say, oh, it's pretty clear that this person, this LSRP, totally missed the boat, no pun intended, about the water body that is directly adjacent. Perhaps there's groundwater plume that looks like it's heading in that direction, or wetlands that crosses the, so when they identify that, they sent it for a review. And the review goes either to reviewers in their group, or it goes to the technical coordinators. There's some in this room. Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and they group together. You can find them closely grouped. And some geologists. This goes to geologists too. Any of those in the room? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so so it goes to them. And from these reviews, we got feedback as to what is, things that are issues, my air quotes again, with submittals involving surface water. So we thought it was important to put this training on today so that we can improve in that area. All right, just super quick. This is a definition of what a remedial investigation is, and I don't need to go through it. Everybody here should know what that is. But in essence, it means delineation of contamination in all media, and that's including surface water, and that's including wetlands and eco and all that. So this is not new news, but we just wanted to emphasize it. And whenever we talk about remedial investigation, timeframes come up. So these are the standard timeframes that the rules set, regulatory timeframes for when you have to complete an RI. This is for cases that began after 2010. So whenever we talk about these, this other one comes up. Okay, cases, what I'm going to just call old cases. All right. Some of us remember 1999 like it was yesterday, but it was a long time ago. Yes, my kids were babies. No, they weren't. Anyway, so they have a specific deadline that was set by statute. And when the deadline was coming up, there was a lot of freaking out, and we're not going to meet it, and we have to do more work. So an extension was provided. Now that deadline is coming up very soon, May 7th, 2016. And that is a deadline. And guess what? It's not going to be moved. As far as we know, there's not going to be any movement on that. So those RIs are supposed to be done for those old cases. All right, and I think Scott talked about this really quickly, just to emphasize everybody's role in this matter. And sometimes we get a little confused. Now, the responsible parties are responsible for doing the remediation consistent with our rules and our guidance. And the LSRP guides them with help from us. So, and the new rules that Scott talked about, you can get to them easily from our website, and you can look at 6.2 that sets in very, very clear way what the highest priority of LSRPs are, which is to perform professional services that are protective of public health and safety and the environment. And today we're going to be emphasizing the environment part. However, when it comes to some of the surface waters and all that, we're also talking about the human health part. So that's it. I want to introduce Ann Hayden, who will talk to you a little bit more about this. And this is nice and warm now for my sweaty hands. There you go.
Thank you, Tessie.
And we're going to take questions at a couple of places. We have so many speakers and so much information. We're going to interject questions at a couple places, and we'll let you know when that happens.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Tessie mentioned, I'm Ann Hayden. I'm a technical coordinator in the Bureau of Environmental Evaluation and Risk Assessment. Our unit provides technical support to various programs in the site remediation program, dealing with data evaluation, risk assessments, and assistance with remedial planning. I'm here to present the Listserv guidance that came out in late November 2015, entitled Investigating Impacts from Contaminated Sites to Surface Water. I intend to cover why this was issued, key concepts, decision points, and available resources. I also just want to mention that my talks will encompass all exposure pathways. It will touch upon the various exposure pathways in which a contaminated site might impact a surface water body, whereas the rest of the presentation this morning is really focused on a single important pathway, that of groundwater discharge to surface water. Tessie already mentioned why we do these trainings and clarifications. When we recognize that there might be some misunderstandings and we feel that additional information is necessary. So that's why this particular two-page listserv was put out. I should have mentioned on the other slide, for those of you who have not yet seen that guidance, it is on our website, so it's the web link is on the slide for easier access in the future for you. One of the things we recognized through our reviews included misunderstandings with when you are investigating a site that potentially involves a water body in the more industrial or urban parts of our state, or when a site or two or more sites may have overlapping issues into a single surface water body, or when a particular site might impact a surface water body that's already being investigated under the jurisdiction of CERCLA, otherwise commonly known as Superfund, the Superfund program. However, despite these factors, it is still incumbent upon persons responsible for conducting remediations to identify delineate and potentially remediate any site-related contamination that may have migrated from their site to surface water and sediment in the state. So where do you begin? Many of you are already very familiar with the key sections of the technical requirements which cover this type of investigation. Subchapter 1.16, the ecological receptor evaluation, subchapter 3.6, the site investigation, subchapter 4.8, remedial investigation, and then in addition I've included subchapter 5.1e, as this subchapter describes the requirements to always identify the presence of any free or residual product that might be associated with your site. This includes any material that may have migrated from your site and now resides in sediment. So the decision points. In the very beginning, you're doing your receptor evaluation. As you know, there's two key questions associated with this. Do you have an ecologically sensitive receptor on, near, or potentially affected by your site? If you do you have contaminant concentrations that exceed ecologically based criteria or standards? At this point in the investigation, you may not have much information, but if you do have some soil data, you can use this information and compare it to the ecological criteria as a conservative early screen. If your receptor evaluation indicates the need for moving forward into a site investigation, early on you're going to need to develop an ecological conceptual site model. This is an example taken from our ecological evaluation technical guidance. And essentially, a conceptual site model characterizes all the potential contaminant pathways at your site. In this case, it's focused on those contaminant pathways which could affect an ecologically sensitive resource. And you evaluate this and determine which of those pathways are complete, potentially complete, or incomplete. Obviously, the pathways that are complete or potentially complete are the ones that you'll need to focus your sampling during your site investigation. And with that sampling, you need to evaluate both historic and current potential discharges from your site to that receptor. The sampling design should consider all possible pathways and in particular be focused on the pathways of greatest concern. As I mentioned, I did mention earlier about subchapter 5.1. You need to identify if there's any free or residual product. You might not have enough investigation underway to identify this, but if there is product or any obvious ongoing discharges, you need to try to abate those early on in the process. Okay. So once you collect your site investigation information, once again, you circle back to your applicable criteria and you compare that data to your criteria. If your contaminant concentrations are not greater than applicable criteria, then you document this in your ecological evaluation report. Just be aware, though, however, that as you continue in your investigation, if previously unknown contaminants or contaminant migration pathways come to light later on, you may need to revisit that pathway to surface water or an ecological receptor. If contaminant concentrations are greater than ecological criteria, then you move on to the remedial investigation for a more focused study. The distinction between an RI and an SI is the RI is at the point where you really need to delineate the full extent of any contamination from a site into surface water and sediment. At this point, you may also be conducting an ecological risk assessment to start forming remedial goals. Complicating factors. So we recognize with a lot of these large water bodies in our state, and particularly ones in the more industrial or urban areas, there could be some complicating factors. These include investigations in urban areas, existing legacy contamination, which is numerous historic discharges for which a particular site may have contributed or may not have contributed to, that might be existing in that water body. Tidal conditions, which can spread contamination far and wide depending on the different kinds of, the magnitude of different discharges. And regulatory overlap, such as the existence of an existing CERCLA or RECRA project that's underway in that water body already. However, none of these factors are justification for not investigating a particular site's potential contribution or impact on a surface water. I wanted to provide this as an illustration to this fact. I'm involved in a lot of the large waterway projects in the state impacted by dioxin contamination, and this is an example of the lower Passaic River, and I wanted to point out that this is a CERCLA investigation. As part of a CERCLA investigation, there are at least 4 operable units associated with this project. Operable units under Superfund refer to, they're almost like AOCs, but the operable units are all related to a single major site or discharge. In this case, in the lower part of the slide, there's a red star. I'm not sure if you can all see that very clearly, but operable unit 1 is the former diamond alkali site in Newark, New Jersey. Operable unit 2 is outlined in pink. That's the lower 8-mile focus feasibility study. Operable unit 3 is outlined in, it's the larger one outlined in orange, and that is the full lower 17 miles of the Passaic River, the entire Tidal section, stretching from Dundee Dam down to the mouth at Newark Bay. Operable unit 4 is Newark Bay. It's off the map. In addition, there were 2 other removal actions in this waterway already completed. The first one is the phase 1 removal identified by the red dashed line near the star. In this case, a very heavy load of the most contaminated dioxin impacted sediments were found and removed at that location. Secondly, further upstream at River Mile 10.9, a removal action was necessitated due to the presence of very high surface sediment contaminations in a mudflat near recreational areas in Lyndhurst. In both cases, the responsible parties came forward to conduct these removal actions in advance of the RIs being completed throughout the whole river system. So, in addition, what I want to describe related to this figure is that for these investigations, the common denominator was a very significant contaminant, that of dioxin, 2378 tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, as well as some other significant co-located contaminants, including total PCBs, mercury, and DDT. For these kinds of investigations, we have these focused contaminants, but it's a very large area. So often, the nature and extent of contamination covering these large areas involves coring transects that are often 1,000 feet apart. So why do I illustrate this? Because of these widely spaced sampling designs, this kind of investigation is not designed to particularly identify contamination that may be emanating from a particular site along the Passaic River, a site for which the contaminants might be different, the discharge might be along utility lines or something more obtruse. So it's really incumbent upon all projects along the Passaic River to fully delineate their own contribution to this water body. So how do you go about doing this in situations where you have potentially overlapping or conflicting programs? The first is, the best resource is the department's Ecological Evaluation Technical Guidance. And the reason that I'm pointing that out is because It's especially useful to guiding development of sampling plans to produce data which will assist you to distinguish between your project's investigation versus potential ambient or background conditions. If possible, also obtain information from other entities, such as other projects operated by other LSRPs, or information that might be available in either state or federal files. Technical consultations, we recommend that you avail yourself of this service so that you can share your ideas with experienced staff. Always use multiple lines of evidence and your best professional judgment. Additional resources. We recognize that ecological evaluations are often highly specialized. So while investigators, especially LSRPs, should be familiar with the process, serious consideration should be given to hiring qualified subcontractors who actually specialize in this area. So enlist the services of someone who can manage the ecological evaluations and risk assessments. Attend specialized courses. As Tessie mentioned, we have the annual ecological risk assessment course coming up at Rutgers University next month. In addition, for projects that are under the jurisdiction of either CERCLA or RCRA, it is important for you to coordinate with the case teams at both EPA and DEP. As described in the administrative guidance and also for the purpose of your need to document this coordination. And this is because perhaps the CERCLA investigation already has a remedial plan. It may be that that remedial plan will cover the type of impact that a particular site along the banks of the Passaic River may be contributing. So there's a lot of coordination that is recommended here, and then to document that coordination in your remedial investigation or your remedial action plan. In some cases, the plan for the CERCLA project may not specifically address a discharge from your site, and therefore you would need, of course, to take care of that. Additional resources, I've just listed some handy websites from the state with regard to finding the locations of national priority list or Superfund sites near your project, where you can find out other information about the known contaminated sites list, 2 websites there, and of course New Jersey GeoWeb is a very handy tool for a lot of information, including this. So the take-home message is that the delineation of site-related contamination into a sensitive receptor area or surface water is an important part of the completed RI and must be done in this phase. And also that these requirements still apply even when a site overlaps with contamination from potentially a neighboring site, or if there's an overlap with regulatory justifications such as CERCLA. And at this time, I'd be happy to entertain any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ann, and thank you, Tessie. We have time for a couple questions, if anyone has any from the audience. Roger. And also, and please just state your name in the beginning.
Roger Ferguson, Penn, Jersey, in the LSRPA. Using your example of the Passaic River area, the entire ironbound is historic fill. It was salt marsh that was backfilled a long time ago. Historic fill is not a discharge. So why are people being told they have to chase their historic fill into the river?
The focus that I'm talking about has to do with discharges on historic fill. We're all aware that historic fill has been placed in a lot of these urban places along large waterways in New Jersey. That was placed to promote development. Much of it was industrial development. We understand about the pre-existing conditions of historic fill, but often the manufacturing operations subsequently, through storage, manufacturing, accidents, what have you, caused chemical discharges on the historic fill. Your focus should be the chemical discharges and their migration to a sensitive receptor.
Can I say something? Nobody ever said that historic fill was not a discharge. No, it does not say that. It says, hold on, I didn't say that.
Hold on, and we'll give Roger the
Okay.
mic back, providing
Roger. We're going to take this outside. No. No, listen.
You know better than that, George.
All right, the whole answer is nobody said it's not a discharge. The legislature said DEP come up with an easier way of dealing with it, which we did in the tech rules. You have to look at the four corners. You have to, be practical about, you can make assumptions, the whole thing. Okay, so she's not saying you have to follow. She didn't say that.
That statement is lost in the sauce and needs to be communicated to the regulated community.
All right.
Because other people are being told by the department that they have to chase their historic fill into the river.
Okay. All right.
It's inconsistent.
We'll try to make that more clear.
Thank you.
All right. So now we have a polite person that waited for.
Time frames. When you have a case where you have another jurisdiction like the EPA doing an investigation and remediation, and you have a site that you have determined is contributing to it, especially on the remediation side where the EPA may dredge at some point at their own timetable. How do we coordinate that with the regulatory and mandatory timeframes that may run out long before EPA gets a dredge out there?
Okay. With regard to that, it's incumbent upon you to do your due diligence to address those time frames. That said, we realize that the federal remedy might not happen for years down the road. This is why it's so important and why it's expressed in that 2-page guidance document that you need to coordinate with EPA. You need to begin that discussion because there may be, and it may be a win-win situation for you to get in advance of that remedy. For instance, if there's product that's emanated from your site, get out there, remove the product. But before you do anything, it's important for you to coordinate with EPA. And that's why we also said you document that coordination because it might be found also, like I think I might have mentioned in the presentation, that it might be mutually agreed that the impact that your site may have contributed to that waterway will be handled by the federal record of decision as well. But you have to do that communication in order and then document it in order to move forward.
Any more questions from the audience? Hearing none, we do have a comment from Ross who says, stay close to the mic during multiple people arguing. You can't hear everyone. And Ross, that is one of the exciting factors of being in the room and handling the mics during the question and answer period. And we will try to do a better job of that.
What? No, we won't. Oh, yeah, we will.
All right. Thank you very much, Ann.
Okay.
That was an awesome job. Thank you, Tessie. Next up, we're going to have Bill Hanrahan's going to give us a overview of the technical guidance document. I also want to thank Bill. This is actually his second technical guidance committee that he has chaired and second document that he's issued. So we thank him and the committee, and Bill will explain who's on the committee. It's not working.
Which one? This happens to me every time. I knew this was going to happen. Yeah, that's right.
Just can you advance that slide?
Okay, so good morning. I'm Bill Hanrahan. Good morning. Keep it down. Okay, so like George said, next we're going to go over the groundwater discharge to surface water document that was issued in January. And the goal of the guidance is to present issues, methods, and things to consider when investigating the discharge of contaminated groundwater to surface water. And I'd like to thank my committee. Next slide. Is it working?
Next slide.
And so some of them are here. The committee. Yeah. Some of them are here. It's Ward Ingersoll in the back. Stand up, Ward, over there. And Dan Cook from AMEC. And Terrence Stanley from Langen. Scott Drew from Geosyntec. I knew that. And what's your name again? Jill Monroe from the Bureau of Groundwater Pollution Abatement. Jill Monroe from the Bureau of Groundwater Pollution Abatement. And Christina Page from Bureau of Inspection and Review. I don't know who else is here. There was, John. And John Rule from Bureau. And there's a couple people that aren't here. Nancy Grosso from DuPont. And who else is in here? Bill Cardasco from TRC was very helpful. All right. The guidance presents an approach for evaluating groundwater discharge to surface water, several conceptual models of groundwater and surface water interaction, guidance on developing site-specific conceptual site model, tools that are available to identify the location of the groundwater discharge, and things to consider for remediation and performance monitoring. The purpose of the guidance is to address the requirements of tech regs. The guidance will help you determine if there is a potential that groundwater contamination is discharging to surface water, and if that potential exists, it provides methods for determining the location of the discharge. It also provides considerations for implementing and monitoring the remedial action. And next we have Jill Monroe. He's going to talk about the first.
Before Jill gets up, though.
But before Jill gets up,
this is the test your knowledge for the webinar participants. This is making sure that they are at their computers and paying attention. So the question for the webinar participants is there a potential that surface water is if there is a potential that surface water is contaminated by a groundwater discharge, sampling locations should be biased to areas that are suspected to be the most contaminated. And that is a true or false question. So I'm just going to poll the audience because I know you guys have all been paying attention in here. How many think that is true?
All right, we got candy for people who raise their hand.
And how many think that is false? I'm really glad people are paying attention in this. So right now we're going to give the webinar audience, so far 52%, 54% have voted. Come on, webinar audience, keep it going because we're going to have to cut it off shortly. There's a couple there that don't have it quite correct. But it's okay. Most of them do. We're up to 83%. Give it a couple more seconds. I'll let you know when we're going to cut that off, Anthony. We're at 32 seconds. We have 85% of the webinar audience have voted. 86%, just want to let you guys know in the webinar, this is very important in case you haven't caught on yet. We're at 87%, and we're going to take it up to 1 minute, and then we'll cut it off, Anthony. Thank you. Okay, we got 3 more, 2, 1. All right, we can cut that off. Just want to let the webinar audience know that only 88% voted on that. Guys, I would hope you would get 100% because you only get 3 out of 4. If you miss any more than that, you do not get CECs. All right, so we're going to move on. And this is still not working correctly. So can you advance that slide for us, Anthony? The best part about running one of these training sessions is the technology, especially when it works. It's even the best. When it doesn't, not so much. No, it's not working. No, because the pointer works.
I don't want to use the pointer.
Oh, there it is. Work now. Let's try this drill. Hold on, we're going to take a test here. Okay, seems to be working. As soon as it does, let me know. All right, so thanks. Up next will be Jill Monroe. Jill is a supervising geologist for the Bureau of Groundwater Pollution Abatement, and she's going to talk about the regulations applicable to investigating surface water impacts from groundwater. Jill?
Okay, thank you, George. So that's who I am, Jill Monroe. I just wanted to let you know that the primary functions of my bureau are the review of permit by rule discharge authorization proposals for in situ remedial actions. We also deal with groundwater classification exception area reviews, and we provide hydrogeologic support to lead programs, including component reviews for the Bureau of Inspection and Review. The technical requirements for site remediation require investigation of contaminant migration pathways and remediation of receptor impacts. The technical guidance document we are discussing today was developed to provide information on the ways groundwater and surface water can interact, to describe tools available to identify discharge areas, and to describe tools available for sampling in order to evaluate this contaminant migration pathway. I will be providing an overview of the regulations that apply to these investigations. So this is just a list of the rules that are the foundation for site remediation decisions. My discussion today will focus on aspects of the groundwater and surface water quality standards, the remediation standards, and the tech rule. The groundwater to surface water guidance document is also intended to work with the groundwater investigation, the conceptual site model, and the ecological evaluation technical guidance documents, as well as the department's field sampling procedures manual. So the remediation standards for groundwater and for surface water are pretty much what we go by. I wanted to point out a couple items concerning the rules and the fact that they adopted the policies, narrative criteria, and numeric standards of the groundwater and surface water quality standards as minimum remediation standards for contaminated sites. The numeric standard tables are probably the most well known, but the policies are also important to the development of site investigation and remedial action plans. Second, groundwater and surface water are treated as receptors that need to be remediated, and they are also migration paths. So any additional receptor impacts along the migration path will need to be evaluated through the RI and addressed through the remedial action. Where the groundwater to surface water contaminant migration pathway is complete, the RI will most likely include an investigation of surface water sediment and ecological receptors. Okay, New Jersey is a water state. By that, I mean that both groundwaters and surface waters are relied on for water supply, commercial activities, and recreational activities. Each water body also supports its own aquatic ecosystem, and some areas, like the Pinelands, are ecologically unique. Since the majority of New Jersey surface waters rely on groundwater to maintain base flows, they are vulnerable to groundwater contaminant impacts. In recognition of the state's reliance on and the importance of water to the people, the economy, and the natural environment, the groundwater and surface water quality standard policies established basically these goals for the protection of water quality and have the policies, numeric, and narrative criteria to achieve them. So basically, in the initial policies for the groundwater and surface water quality standards, the focus really is to maintain water quality that's better than standards, restore water quality that's worse than standards, preserve natural water quality in designated areas, protect public health, safeguard aquatic life, and enhance the multiple uses of water. These are the questions you need to ask yourself, basically, when you're doing any of these investigations and coming up with remedial action plans. So we put this figure into the presentation to represent that not all sites with a groundwater investigation will impact surface water quality. For the sites that do have a contaminated groundwater discharge to surface water, the interaction of the two systems will need to be characterized, and the remedial action is going to need to address impacts to both groundwater and surface water. Several ways that groundwater and surface water interact are discussed in the guidance and will be presented later in this program. Based on the variety of hydrogeological environments and the variability of site sources and plumes, some contaminant migration situations are going to be complex and others are going to be somewhat straightforward. The tools that are described in the guidance to identify and sample discharge zones to characterize migration apply to simple and complex situations. So what are some of the triggers that surface water is going to be on your radar screen? Basically, anytime you identify odors, seeps, petroleum sheens, or have some other observation that indicates contamination is entering the waterway, you're going to trigger surface water as a pathway. A lot of times we use groundwater elevation and sample results near surface water as a trigger that we need to look at the surface water body. And other times you look at other hydrogeological data and modeling of plume conditions to predict a intersection with surface water. But sometimes we'll have sites that are some distance away from surface water, and tracking the plume is where you find that connection. So because some of these triggers are based on groundwater data, you can have a groundwater investigation that's fairly advanced before surface water even comes into the picture. So the site investigation is basically, is the contamination here or not? And to do those, we try to bias the sampling to the suspected locations of greatest contamination. Like I said before, groundwater elevations and contaminant isopleth maps can be used to determine where the most contaminated plume discharge area might be. The tools described in the guidance can then help locate the actual discharge zones for sampling. Discharge zones should include sediment pore water and surface water samples, as well as groundwater samples from the nearest plume well locations to assess the groundwater contaminant migration pathway to surface water. This is similar to the evaluation of vapor intrusion impacts, where you take a groundwater sample, a subslab sample, and indoor air sample. So we're trying to track contaminants from point A through the discharge zone and into the water column to see how that pathway is working. The sediment pore water sampling will also help evaluate aquatic life and sediment quality impacts, and if contaminant transformations are occurring in the sediment zone between groundwater and surface water. Site investigation analyses must include the groundwater plume contaminants of concern and try to be conducted under worst case conditions and in where you think the highest concentrations would be, and should probably include field parameters to help evaluate contaminant transformation processes. So when you find contamination from the SI phase, the RI is then needed to delineate the actual extent of all your discharge zones and the horizontal and vertical extent of the impact in the surface water body, as well as receptors. Based on the surface water quality standards, existing surface water quality is needed to help define conditions outside of the groundwater discharge zone, and this data helps you understand any relative change in water quality due to the discharge. Existing surface water uses also need to be confirmed and made part of the receptor evaluation. Any IEC conditions would need to be addressed. Existing uses that need to be considered or included in your RI include the natural biota of the surface water body, as well as any human uses for water supply or recreation. Some surface water impacts may extend beyond the site boundary and site controls, and where this happens, the investigator will need to comply with the off-site notification requirements identified in the ARCS rule. So when the groundwater contamination pathway is complete, again, the remedial action has to address the impact to the groundwater and the impact to the surface water. And we'll need to include some surface water specific information. The surface water classification and anti-degradation category need to be identified in the remedial action plan. There are 9 classifications and 3 anti-degradation categories that reflect the diversity of New Jersey's surface water systems, their uses, and relative level of protection. In essence, the higher the anti-degradation category, the more protected the water system is. Existing surface quality outside of the discharge area, along with the anti-degradation category, will influence remedial action implementation and the endpoint. Where water quality is worse than standards, a site must remediate its groundwater discharge to help restore surface water quality. Where water quality is better, you should basically be trying to address your discharge so you maintain that better than standard water quality. Existing uses need to be protected or mitigated, and contaminant concentrations, fate and transport, the actual extent across stream, vertically and downstream in the surface water body that you've impacted need to be considered as part of the plan. Sediment and ecological receptors of groundwater contaminants discharged to surface water also need to be included. So again, this is clearly my favorite slide because I put it in twice. And I really do think, in essence, if you can answer these questions as part of your, investigation and, what are you going to accomplish in your remedial action, you have to be able to answer these questions. And as you do that, you'll find you're going to be you'll work your way through the remediation standards and the tech rule requirements. But these are the questions to ask and answer through your remedial action plan. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jill. And actually, we're just going to open it up really quick to any questions that we have on in the audience. I'll just take us a second.
If you can go back just one slide. Okay, so the question was, in terms of your remedial action planning, your contaminants of concern, you're talking about surface water, which we think of as more discharge, and from a testing standpoint, we think of it under the Clean Water Act, the 600 series methods, priority pollutant list. If we think of groundwater, we think of the SW846 analytical methods, and we think of target compound list. So the question obviously becomes, when the remediation professional calls the testing lab to order services, the lab is going to ask, what methods and what analyte list. I'm assuming the data sets should be comparable, groundwater to surface water, so you can evaluate the discharge or contaminant migration. But, that's a question that...
Anybody familiar with methods? I have not looked at the methods lists side by side. I don't think it's been an issue in...
I was going to say, for most of our investigations, you want comparable data. So I would say yes, especially if you're looking for what's in the groundwater and where it may be discharging to surface water. So I would think that the answer to that would be yes. Bill, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
It's not something that we addressed in the guidance at all. So.
Okay, so the guidance really didn't speak to that. However, I would say in most of the investigations, especially traditional ones that we conducted, you always wanted to have comparable data. So I would think that that would be a concern. Let's take something from the webinar. Let's see. Ross is also telling us to stay close to the mic. What if EPA isn't as far along as to have a ROD when you're doing your RI? That's an earlier one?
That was answered, I think, earlier.
Yeah, I think Ann did talk about the ROD and US EPA timeframes. Let's go to Robert. Is remediation still required if ecological surface water quality standards are exceeded, but a full complete ERA indicates there are no ecological risks?
Nancy? Do you understand the question?
We're going to pull in a ringer.
Nancy
We have
Hamill.
Nancy Hamill in the room. Nancy's a DEP staff who works with the ecological risk and receptors.
Okay, remediation is required to the higher of the eco-screening criteria or the risk-based remediation goal or background. I'm not sure if that answers the question. I can't read it.
I know, you have to go way up there.
But I think they're saying that you have a site where the quality, surface water quality standards are exceeded, but you do an ERA and that says that there are no ecological risks. So they're wondering, is remediation still required?
If the surface water quality standards are exceeded, that would mean that there is some sort of ongoing impact, ongoing discharge.
Right, but I think
but
the
you
same-
would have a background evaluation, and for example, they may be exceeded because of contamination coming from an upgradient or a tidal situation and not site related. So the responsibility of the LSRP would be to tease apart if it's from a site or an
Okay.
off-site source.
I think what they're getting to though, if you do an ecological risk assessment
Okay.
and it shows that there are no risks, do you still have to remediate?
Well, those are promulgated surface water standards. That
Right, so the standards would
implies-
drive it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, so the standards, even though there's no ecological risk, you're still being driven by the exceedance of the standards?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Any other questions in the room?
We got a lot to cover.
Okay, excellent. And we have
Thank you,
none
Joe.
on the web, so we're going to move on. Next up, we have Terrence Stanley. Terrence is going to talk a little bit about the development of a conceptual model for groundwater surface water interaction. So it might take a second before that actually works. I think we have to dock that. Let's see if it works now. There we go. One more. Okay.
Good morning. My name is Terrence Stanley. I'm a geologist with Langen Engineering. And my section today, I'll be discussing the actual physical process of groundwater surface water interaction. And I'll be presenting some general conceptual models of groundwater interaction with surface water features. And these surface water features include streams, wetlands, lakes, and coastal settings. I'll also talk a little bit about the hyporheic zone, which is a unique zone associated with streams. Now, the use of these generalized conceptual models is to create a framework or to designate a framework in which a detailed site-specific model can be assembled. Again, a conceptual site model is a concise presentation of the most important features of a site. And once you've gone and done a more involved investigation on your site, when you have aquifer test results and analytical results, and can also integrate unique site features such as sewers or groundwater withdrawal, you can then create a more detailed site-specific conceptual site model. And the conceptual site model is useful in that it can support technical decisions regarding investigation and remediation, but it also can assist in in communication with interested parties. Now, initially, you have a conceptual model, and you can create a preliminary conceptual site model using several online resources that are available. These include online resources for topographic maps, geographic information system files, geological maps, hydrogeologic parameters from Geologic Survey's database, and surface and groundwater monitoring networks from the Geologic Survey. And there, in the actual guidance, there are web links that you can follow to get to these particular sites. Now, the first type of groundwater surface water interaction I want to talk about is streams. Specifically, as you can see in the upper left, if you have groundwater elevations in your monitoring wells adjacent to your surface water bodies, and those elevations are higher than the stream, groundwater flows from the aquifer into your stream, and that's called a gaining stream. Conversely, if groundwater elevations in adjacent monitoring wells are lower than your stream, you have what is called a losing stream, and groundwater or surface water flows out of the stream into the underlying aquifer. There are two particular types of losing streams. Excuse me. There's a connected losing stream in which the water table actually intersects the surface water. And then there is a disconnected losing stream in which there is a unsaturated zone between the surface water and the groundwater. In New Jersey, under natural conditions, you're generally not going to find losing streams. They're mostly gaining streams. There's also a situation where the groundwater gradient parallel to your stream is equivalent to the gradient of the stream, and you will have no interaction between the surface water and the groundwater. And lastly, you can have a combination gaining losing, where you have groundwater flowing into a stream on one side and then out of the stream on another side. Now, all these types of interactions can change both spatially and temporally. Spatially, things can change based on variations in geology within a particular drainage basin, and they can also change temporally due to short-term events like storms or long-term events like seasonal cycles. The hyperradial zone is a unique feature of groundwater interacting with streams. The hyperradial zone occurs in fluvial stream bed sediments through which upwelling groundwater and downwelling surface water mix vigorously. Mixing in the hyperradial zone can be enhanced by localized stream features such as bed roughness and turbulence, such as pool riffle sequences, and meanders in which water is forced to flow out of the stream into the stream bank. The characteristics of the hyperradial zone. The hyperradial zone's thickness can vary from inches to feet. And some of the hyperradial zone is important in a physical sense that it moderates river temperatures and provides a source and sink for river sediments. It's important from an ecological standpoint in that it's a habitat for benthic and interstitial organisms and is a rooting zone for aquatic plants. The mixing of well-oxygenated surface waters also promotes the growth of aerobic bacteria at shallow depths in the hyperradial zone, and in deeper regions of the hyperradial zone, anaerobic bacteria can flourish where oxygen has been depleted. Some biogeochemical characteristics of the hyperradial zone includes enhanced cation exchange capacity in the sediments and oxidation reduction reactions. And the result of all these unique features in the zone is that many solutes are highly reactive in this zone, and under appropriate conditions, the biodegradation of organic contaminants or the precipitation of dissolved metals can occur. Another interaction of groundwater with surface water is with wetlands. In Figure A, wetlands are often occur where the water table is perennially shallow, and groundwater tends to seep out at the surface. Wetlands also occur in Figure C in topographic depressions and interact similarly to way lakes interact with groundwater. In Figure B, wetlands also occur on slopes, also called fens, and they are fed primarily by groundwater recharge. And in Figure D are upland wetlands, also called bogs, that are fed primarily by recharge from precipitation. Another interaction between groundwater and surface water is lake interactions. These interactions appear similar to groundwater stream interactions, but are not as dynamic. In Figure A, you have a receiving lake in which groundwater flows from the aquifer into the surface water. You also have seepage to groundwater in Figure B. Then you also have a combination flow through of groundwater entering surface water at one side of the lake and seeping out at the other side of the lake. The difference between lakes and streams is that lake levels usually do not change as rapidly as streams do. Also, bank storage is of lesser importance compared to streams. Evapotranspiration is more important on lakes due to their larger surface area. And finally, lake bottom sediments usually have greater organic material deposits, which can affect the rate of exchange between surface water and groundwater.
Go again.
We just want to reinforce that there, Terrence.
And the last type of interaction is it's in the coastal environment. And due to shallow water tables in coastal environments, wetlands and tidal flats experience evapotranspiration directly from water table, which is an extremely important process. Groundwater exchange can also be affected in coastal regions by precipitation, lithology, tidal range, and groundwater hydraulic gradient. And in summary, we presented several types of conceptual models that can be tailored to a particular site and used as a preliminary assessment tool for investigations. These conceptual models can be used to develop a site-specific conceptual model as your desktop study progresses and also as your site is further investigated. And that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Terrence. We're not going to take questions right now, but we're going to move on to the next section, and then we'll take questions after John. Up next, we have John Rule. He's going to talk a little bit about methods and tools for locating and characterizing contamination. So, John, you just did. There you go. Oh, go back one. Okay, go forward one. But before John, which is a surprise for me. I thought this came a little bit later, but apparently it is here. So again, right now we have a quiz for webinar participants. Webinar participants, pay attention. Again, you need to answer 3 out of 4 of these. So hopefully you're answering all 4, which would make me very happy. So the question for webinar participants is, what typically follows a desktop review to help refine the conceptual site model? The options are a call to the DEP hotline, a site investigation, or happy hour. Most of the people in-house, just to let you know, webinar participants like the happy hour answer, but we're going to poll them and actually see if that is true. So who thinks it is number 1? Okay, who thinks it is number 2? And who thinks it is number 3? All right, we do have a couple 3s. I think I'm with you on that one. But we do know what the actual answer is. So far, we have 80% voted. Keep that up, webinar participants. %. There are over about 220 people on the webinar. Again, we give them 1 minute. Yes, we did. Tessie's in favor of the happy hour as well. We have 80, 90%. That's a little bit better than the first one, so I'm very proud of you webinar participants. We have 10 more seconds that we will leave this open, and then we will shut it down. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Thank you, Anthony. You can shut that down. And thank you, webinar participants, for answering those questions. Again, that will allow you to be eligible for CECs if you answer 3 out of 4 of those. And certainly to make sure that you are at your desk and paying attention. Okay, so you can go to the next slide, John, if that does work. There we go. So again, Introducing John Rule, who's going to talk a little bit about methods and tools. John?
Good morning. I'm John Rule. I'm a technical coordinator in Bureau. Yeah, perhaps.
John, you want to just use this handle? You can actually move away from it.
Bill Cordasco of TRC and I were tasked with compiling the methods and tools for locating and characterizing groundwater contamination to surface water.
Nope, don't.
Oh. There we go. These are covered in section 6 of the guidance document and includes appendices C and D and table 2. I want to let you know that these tools and methods are not exhaustive. There's probably more out there. I came across a couple more when just preparing the presentation. As I mentioned before, it was compiled by Bill Cordasco of TRC and myself.
A little louder. A little closer.
There are generally 2 groundwater to surface water investigation triggers: your inspections at the beginning of your PA and your receptor evaluation. But this will focus on the information from your ongoing groundwater investigation. So when locating groundwater to surface water discharge zones and points, the committee agreed that probably the 2 physical properties of temperature and conductivity and resistivity were best because they were most cost effective, easy to use, and relatively quick. For temperature, you can use a ground level thermal imaging camera. This is a forward-looking infrared camera, or FLIR. It produces an image such as what you're seeing here. The dark blue area is your groundwater seep flowing into a warmer surface water body, probably a stream. I don't think we're going to have the movie, huh?
Are we going to have the movie? Can we get the movie? They're working on it. Give them a second.
Wow.
Look at this.
This didn't work yesterday. Okay. This is also a FLIR imaging movie, and the groundwater in yellow is flowing into the surface water body and mixing. Eventually, it will attain the color and the temperature of the surface water body, which is kind of a purple. The FLIR cameras can also be brought up in planes, and this was a handheld FLIR camera. The site is a fish pond in Hawaii, and in the lower left of the picture, we see cooler blue, dark blue colored groundwater entering a warmer, light blue surface water body. It's only about a temperature change of 2 degrees, but it's enough to point out where that zone is. There's also handheld instruments that one can use on the ground. In this particular case, this instrument is measuring pH and temperature. There are 2 separate probes. You can not see it too well, but they're being dipped into a pool of water there. So this can be employed when you're looking for or conducting a more focused or discrete point investigation. There are differences in how thermometers versus thermocouples and thermistors operate, which I won't get into because I don't fully understand, but there are advantages and disadvantages, and they are often found on the internet, either by the manufacturers of the equipment or by other researchers. Another type of thermal measurement is the fiber optic distributed temperature sensing survey. This is a fairly expensive tool, but it is used over longer stretches. This example shows a 300-meter fiber optic cable, but it can be up as much as 30,000 feet. And what is done is essentially a light is pulsed along the cable. There's scatter that occurs within the cable, and that scatter is picked up by a computer, and that scatter is in part controlled by temperature. So using the computer, they're then able to deduce what the temperature is if there is an impinging groundwater discharge into your surface water body. This specific example was of the Shenandoah River in Virginia, and the fiber optic cable was able to identify a groundwater zone of just a degree cooler temperature difference from the surface water body, but was able to peg it. We can also use conductivity and resistivity, again using a handheld probe and employ it in a more focused investigation once more. And depending upon the manufacturer, you can get quite a few parameters out of some of these. Our focus is on the conductivity and resistivity, but if you were near a saline water body, salinity might be something you'd also check out, or in an agricultural area, nitrates. If you happen to have a discharge that has a strong pH, either alkaline or acidic, pH may also be a parameter you'd want to look at. On a larger scale investigation, there's the towed electronic probe. In this example, the probe is being towed across a lake bottom. The area in the middle represents a zone of groundwater influx, and as in the diagram below, where that groundwater is inflowing, it typically has a higher conductivity. These probes can also accommodate other tools for temperature measuring, and if you're successful and able to tow it along the bottom because it's smooth and it's soft and such, then that's a benefit. There are times though when the bottoms are rocky, full of debris, you'd need to suspend the probe up in the water column. Through most of New Jersey, you're going to be looking at sediment pore water evaluations also, because you rarely have a bottom of a stream or a lake or any water body that is showing pure bedrock. So much of the rest of the talk I'm going to give today focuses on the sediment pore water evaluation. So there are 4 different types: diffusion sampling, equilibrium sampling, direct pore water sampling, and centrifugation. The first 3 are in situ measurements, and the last one, you collect sediments, bring them back to the lab, and centrifuge them to get the water out. Other information on these methods is also found in Appendix F of the sediment pore water sampling techniques of the EETG guidance. With diffusion sampling, it allows an equilibrium to be attained between the surrounding water, your surface water, across it, that is your pore water across a diffusion barrier to a capture medium. So there are 8 different samplers that can be used, and all of these are deployed in situ and are later retrieved. The water dialysis or passive diffusion bag is simply a water permeable membrane. It's filled with deionized or distilled water and sealed, placed in a protective container, which in this case is a slotted piece of PVC, and then embedded in the sediment. It's later retrieved and the bag sent to the lab where the groundwater or the bagged water there is sampled and analyzed. On a somewhat larger scale, but the same basic principles of peeper, the jars in the lower part of that picture are all filled with deionized water, and then there's a permeable membrane that's placed on top, and the individual jars are placed into the cavities in that device, and then the device is brought to the field where it's driven down into the sediment, later to be retrieved, the bottles removed and analyzed. This particular type of peeper can give you a vertical profile of your sediment pore water contamination. The nylon screen diffusion sampler is one that I discovered recently when I was putting this presentation together. Essentially, it's a lab sample jar with the top drilled out, a membrane of a very tight nature, 120 micron, is placed over the top after the jar is filled with distilled water. The cap is screwed back on, and then this apparatus is buried in the sediment, given time to equilibrate with the surrounding pore waters, retrieved, and in this example, a syringe is being used to extract that water where it will be sent to the lab for analysis. This is a DET or diffusion equilibration in thin films device. There's a gel that's mixed and then put into the center of this device. It's actually a shallow cavity, about a half millimeter to a millimeter thick. Then a permeable acetate filter membrane is placed over the top, and it is inserted down into the sediment, and the same thing occurs where the pore waters will filter across that permeable membrane and will accumulate in the polymer gel. Later, it's retrieved, and because the gel is semi-solid, it can be partitioned, and a vertical profile can also be obtained of contaminants. The DGT is similar, except that there is a middle layer that's a diffusion layer, but there is a resin at the base of it that is the collecting medium. On the top, you have your filter membrane, which protects against sediment entering it. It's deployed, buried in the sediment, later retrieved, and again sent to the lab for analysis. The bottom example is more of a vertical profiling apparatus driven into the sediment, but if need be, you could also collect chemistry information from the surface water. This is kind of a soup to nuts sampler. Works on the same principles. It's attached to a rod driven down into the sediment. There is a medium in that tube that will absorb the contaminants from the pore water. You can attach several of these to a single pole for vertical profiling. And once it's retrieved, it's placed back in the manufacturer's sample jar and sent back to the manufacturer for analysis. This device is most often used to act as a surrogate for aquatic fish tissue analysis. In this example, there's a gel called trialine that's placed between the two membranes, and it's put into the sediment. It's allowed to equilibrate with the sediment pore water chemistry, retrieved, and then analyzed for the contaminants of concern. Then come the equilibrium samplers. Now these are very good for your semi-volatile organics, PCBs, PAHs, chlorinated pesticides, dioxins, and furans. Essentially, it's three types of plastics: polyethylene, polyoxymethylene, and polydimethylsiloxane. The first two can usually be found as not fabrics, but as sheeting. The polyethylene can even be obtained in the hardware store. The polydimethylsiloxane in the bottom sample with the ruler is the coating that is typically found on fiber optic cables. So what you do with these fibers is embed them in the sediment and later retrieve them, and they are analyzed directly. Then we have the direct pore water sampling equipment. There are 5 systems. This is a pore water piezometer. The white probe is inserted down into the sediment. Tubing is attached to the upper end. It's run through a peristaltic pump, and the sediment pore water is collected in the sample bottle and then sent to the lab for analysis. There are also push point samplers. This is a more low-tech type of setup. It's simply a hollow tube with perforations in the bottom. It's driven down into the sediment. Pore water is extracted through the tube into the tubing and into your sample bottle. This is a micro sampler. This one is almost a meter long, but the business end where the pore water is extracted is only about a 4 centimeter zone. This is a much more sophisticated piece of equipment. It was developed by the U.S. Navy. It can provide contaminant concentration, temperature, and conductivity. And in this example, the temperature and conductivity sensor is on the base of the right probe, whereas the pore water sampling end of it is on the left probe. There's also a reference temperature and conductivity sensor that sits above the probes that would be sitting in the standing water body. This is driven down into the sediments. If you were to collect the sample, it's going up through that tube to the deck above on the boat you're on. This device is also a U.S. Navy invention called the UltraSeep. It does everything that the Trident probe does. Trident probe is generally used for identifying locations for where groundwater may be flowing into surface water. Once you've identified that zone or zones, then the UltraSeep, again, allows you to collect temperature data, conductivity data, contaminant concentration, but also one additional thing, advective flux coming out of that sediment. Lastly, there's centrifugation. It's low tech, but it works. You would need to collect the large volumes of bulk sediments from the field, return them to the lab, and centrifuge them to extract the pore water, and then you can analyze them. If your sediment pore water investigation, or even if you have a situation where you have bedrock directly feeding the ground, the surface water, now you're into a surface water assessment. I'm not going to go into these methods. They've been there for a couple of decades in the Field Sampling Procedures Manual, but the two most common methods mentioned in the manual are the dip grab, which is simply taking your sample jar and dipping it in the surface water where you believe that your groundwater is most contaminated coming into it, or use a pump and tubing. Questions? Ross, did you hear me?
Thank you, John. So we're going to open up the questions to John and Terrence, who just presented before John. So any questions from the in-house audience? Oh, we do. And please state your name again before asking a question.
Ted Toscos. John, the various pore water sampling methods, how comparable are they? Some involve equilibration, others are discrete samples. Presumably, those things play on your geochemistry. Is there any sense for how comparable all the sample collection methods are?
I don't know of any comparison of all these methods. What I was finding was you would have a researcher who would use a certain method and then describe the pluses and the minuses of having used that method. Many of the methods that I've showcased are used in the ecological evaluations because it's mostly focused on sediment pore water, and the sediment pore water is often the medium that is used, or should say affects the organisms. But I don't know of any study that would give pluses or minuses for which is better than the other. A lot of it comes down to cost and what you have available.
I think also, Ted, some of those sampling methods also are targeted for certain types of contaminants. Some work with metals, some don't work with VOs. I think you really need to look at what the capability of each sampling method is. Have another question over here?
Actually, this is just a follow-on comment. Eileen Snyder, Alpha Analytical. There is guidance coming out mid-year this year. It's supposed to be about June-ish. And this is sponsored by EPA, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, in cooperation, called SRDRP. And the guidance is a two-part guidance. It's going to be focused entirely on the passive sampling devices, how to calibrate them, how to deploy them in the field, the comparability, etc. So stay tuned. Again, it's SRDRP, the website. There should be a profile up there.
That's Department of Defense sponsors that? Department of Energy. Okay. And that's SRDRP, and you can find that on the web. They actually have a lot of good guidance documents out there, so that's good. Other questions from in-house? Seeing none, let me take a couple from the web. Let's see. Let's go from Rocco. It says, how do you prove that there is not a discharge to surface water if you have a disconnected losing stream and a groundwater is diving under the stream? That might be Terrence, is that more targeted towards your diagrams for losing and gaining streams?
How do you tell there's not a discharge?
George, just hydraulic, just wells.
Bill, I think you need a microphone here. Hold on.
Hold on. We're going to let Bill answer this.
Just hydrology, just having wells placed in your aquifer and showing that the surface water elevation is higher. You'd have to do that over time. I mean, it's unusual in New Jersey, except if there's overpumping in the coastal plain.
Okay, so I think the technical answer is you really have to look at your hydrogeology, you have to look at your groundwater elevations, and you have to look at your surface water levels. And it's all using your technical and professional opinion or judgment. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. I am confused at what point the the pore water should be sampled. What part of the investigation? That was kind of a Jill, I think, question when she was going through the SI and RI. But Bill, do you have an answer for that? I think one thing that Jill had identified is that oftentimes in the SI, you're not even sure if you have a surface water impact until you delineate your plume. And then as soon as you find out you do have potential impact based on groundwater elevations, how close you are to surface water, then you would start to conduct that investigation. But Bill has a little bit to add to that. Bill?
Yeah, you would investigate as soon as your conceptual model shows that there's a potential for an impact. That's what the tech regs require. When there is a potential for an impact to surface water, you have to investigate it, just like any other media. So you develop your conceptual model, you determine that your plume may be discharging to surface water, and you investigate surface water.
And I think oftentimes what some of the confusion might be is typically in a site investigation, you're just documenting that an AOC has a potential discharge. So you're sampling at each AOC. You might not actually have enough information really to go into a surface water or even know that there's a surface water impact unless you're right close to that or you have an AOC close to a surface water body and you know that impact up front. But I think lots of times, especially when Jill was talking about when you have a lot of groundwater data, and oftentimes you don't have a lot of groundwater data until you move into the RI stage. So I can see how there would be some confusion. Let's move on to the next one. It's from Robert. It says, how flexible is the department regarding laboratory certification requirements for analysis by specialized labs? That's a good question. Yeah. Typically, this guidance is really right now focused on the technical aspects of sampling, not necessarily the analytical. However, that would be a good question for Greg Toffoli, who runs the department's QA/QC section. Let's see, I think that is all the questions we have. We do. Okay, you can close that out, Anthony. Thank you very much. And thank you guys for your patience. Let's see if we can move on. Can we advance that slide, Anthony? There we go. Up next, we have Michael Gagliano. Michael is from New Jersey Geological and Water Survey. He's going to talk a little bit about electrical resistivity methods for groundwater seepage zones. So, Michael? Yes.
Okay. You can test it out.
There
okay, good. Hi, yes, I'm Mike Gagliano from the New Jersey Geological Survey. So we're part of the NJDEP. We're just a little field office out there. And today I want to talk about using geophysics to actually characterize and delineate groundwater, surface water interactions, and contaminations. And some of these tools we can use for geophysics, there's ground penetrating radar, there's electromagnetics, there's magnetometers, there's borehole geophysics. But today I'm going to talk about electrical resistivity and at a specific spot in New Hampshire. So, sorry this isn't New Jersey, but this happened up in New Hampshire, and this was a good lake for this study, which you'll find out why in a minute. But Mirror Lake, New Hampshire, it's part of the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, so it's a long-term study site of the USGS. There's tons of data up there, geological data, biological data, wildlife, all that stuff. I mean, they've been studying this place for years. So that's where this happened. And Mirror Lake, it's a small glacial lake. It's underlined by fractured crystalline bedrock. And over that bedrock, it's covered by glacial till and glacial outwash, which is like sand and gravel. So, and then this till and outwash is covered by like organic sediments. So you walk around the lake and you can see these like fine leaves, all kinds of little things. And closer to the center of the lake, it's really thick. Closer to the edge of the lake, it's real thin. But it turns out this affects seepage, at least locally. So we're going to find out about that. So the study site actually worked on two spots here, but I'm going to focus right now on the southwest shore here. And so the southwest shore has, on your left, is covered by till, and then on your right there, it's covered by glacial outwash. And then again, this sort of organic sediment kind of covers the entire place. And the reason we chose this was because we're going to be using seepage meters to actually measure the rate of seepage here. And the southwest shore has seepage rates of up to 300 centimeters per day. So it's actually pretty quick to measure here. So this kind of goes back to one of Terrence's slides when he was talking about lake water, groundwater interaction here. In this case, Mirror Lake is sort of the dual case. So it's gaining at the northeast inlet, and then there's out seepage, or it's losing at the southwest shore, which is on the left side right there. So that's the case here. So what's this all about? So there's a geologist in the USGS out of Denver. His name's Don Rosenberry. And he sort of, I don't know, pioneered is not the best word, but he sort of perfected this method here of using seepage meters. And, you know, he studies this all over the country. And he goes to all these lakes and streams, and he put these seepage meters in. And they take a long time. They're a lot of work. And so we thought, hey, there's got to be a better way, or at least a way to sort of focus where we can place them. So this is a seepage meter, and it's a little bit hard to explain, but basically there's two parts to it. There's up on the top there, it's the top of like a 55-gallon drum. So you cut that in half, and then you attach a hose to it, and then at the other end there's a baggie, and the baggie's inside this little Tupperware thing to protect it from waves and such like that. So what you do is you fill the bag with a predetermined amount of water, usually about halfway. And then you take the seepage meter, the big blue drum, and you kind of push it into the sediments, and you let it equilibrate for a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes. And then, so what happens is, if you have groundwater entering the lake, what happens is the baggie over here fills up, because the groundwater comes in through the drum and the bag fills up. Vice versa, if there's, you know, lake water going into the groundwater, which we had in this case, the bag empties, because it creates pressure in there, and it sucks the bag dry. So you fill the bag with some amount of water, you weigh it, you let it run for some amount of time, and then you weigh it again. You can get seepage rates in centimeters per day. And again, this spot was great at the southwest shore because the seepage rates were so high. So we could let the bag sit for like 5 or 10 minutes, and we can actually get a measurement. Some places you have to let this thing sit overnight or even longer to actually get the bag to empty or fill. So that's sort of the issue with seepage meters. And so we thought, hey, you know, maybe we can use geophysics, in this case, again, electrical resistivity, to not replace seepage meters. And that's the key thing with all geophysics. We're not replacing sort of the point measurements, but we're trying to, you know, make it more focused and more efficient. So we thought, can we use geophysics to say, you know, we don't need to put seepage meters here at least. We can focus it to this one spot. So in this case, we used electrical resistivity. And for this particular use case, the factors linking groundwater and resistivity here, there's porosity, saturation, resistivity of the pore water, and then that affects the bulk overall resistivity of what we get. In this case, it's under the lake, so the saturation's constant, and it's fresh water, so the resistivity of the pore water is constant. So what's affecting the overall resistivity then is changes in porosity. That's basically what's going on here. Now, this equation here is called Archie's law. It breaks down under certain circumstances, and that's if there's salt water, if there's clay involved. So if those two cases happen, this kind of doesn't work because the conductivity of the salt and the clay affects it more. But in any case, there's no clay here and there's no salt water here, so Archie's law applies. Later on in the talk, I go to the other side of the lake where you'll see some saltwater issues. Oh.
Okay, here we go again.
I get a break.
You get to relax for a second there, Michael, while we talk to the webinar audience and the participants. This is your third quiz question. Today's question is one factor that links groundwater and resistivity. Not that we just saw that, but I think we did. We have three choices. The first one is saturation. The second is cell phone service. And the third one is topography. So can we open up the... Hey, there we go. We're opening it up as we speak.
Should I hum the Jeopardy?
And there we go to the third one. Yes, you can hum.
Can I hum the Jeopardy tune?
Absolutely. So now, webinar audience, feel free to vote on that. It's open up now. I'm going to poll the in-house audience because they have been incredibly intelligent for the last two. So we're going to ask how many think it is number one. These guys are smart. How many think it is number two? I knew we would have a couple, including Tessie. Thank you, Tessie. And number three, topography. Okay, I will tell everyone on the webinar audience that the in-house audience did excellent on that particular question. We're looking at the number of people who have chimed in so far. We have 79%, and you got 20 seconds left. 81%, look at that, there we go. Guys, make sure you chime in because this is a requirement for CEC eligibility for the webinar participants. We have 7 seconds left. 85% voting, 86. 1 minute. Okay, we can close that, Anthony. Thank you so much. And thank you for the webinar audience for participating. And we're going to close this. Michael, you'll be able to use that in just a second.
Okay.
Just takes a second to reset itself. Okay, see if it's working now. Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, so I just talked about Archie's law, which links groundwater and resistivity. So let me just talk a little bit about what electrical resistivity is. And basically what we do is we inject the current into the subsurface and we measure how much current comes back. And from that we can calculate how resistive the ground is below. And in order to do that, we need, at its most basic form, 4 electrodes. So we have 2 current electrodes here. So the A and the N over there, they're current electrodes. So one's a current source and one's a current sink. So the current flows from A to N or vice versa. And then in between we have 2 potential electrodes. And so what they're doing is as the current goes through, we're measuring the drop in voltage. And from that it calculates your resistivity. This is sort of the old school way of doing it. You had 4 electrodes and you'd hook them up to a battery and you'd write measurements down. Now it's a lot quicker. We have automated systems, which is actually, if I go back to my last slide, that's actually the tool we use. So you can see the electrodes sitting on the ground here. These are actually sitting on the lake surface. Those silver things are the electrodes, and then that's the control box up there. So what that control box does is that we have a cable with 28 electrodes or more, depending on the system you have, and it picks which 2 are the current electrodes, and then it fires them at different intervals, and it picks which other ones are the potential electrodes. And again, the way this works is the further the current electrodes are, the deeper you get into the ground. And the closer together, the more shallow you get into the ground. So if you want to go deeper, you move them apart. If you want to get shallower, you move them closer together. The nice things about these systems is that because you have this cable spread out, you can get deep and shallow, depending on the electrode spacing, all in one shot. So that's what's going on here. It's showing you how you move these apart and you get deeper. Again, just like with any other geophysics method, deeper means less resolution, and shallower means more resolution, but you lose depth. So there's always that trade-off. In this case, we were looking pretty close to the surface, so we had pretty close electrode spacing, so pretty good resolution here. So anyway, that's geophysics. Mirror Lake had a lot of ducks, so I have a lot of pictures of ducks. So this is the southwest shore of Mirror Lake, where we did some of this stuff. And so there's the sand and gravel stuff on the right, which again, sand and gravel outwash is well sorted, right? So it's pretty well sorted. It's all kind of the same size. And then Until's like not so well sorted, so it's all kinds of different sizes. So in theory, right, the outwash should have good porosity and the till not so good porosity, so less flow. And that's actually how it works out. So there's a couple lines here. One, there's this long line that goes along the shore. That's that red line. And then there's this blue line that goes sort of half in the lake, half on land. And then there's a couple of 3D surveys here, which I just didn't have time to talk about today, but they happened, and they weren't really helpful actually anyway, so I kind of cut them out. So all right, so on to some data here. This first thing really doesn't have to do anything with groundwater, surface water interaction or anything. This is just showing one method that we can use for resistivity. And in this case, I was running my resistivity stuff out in the lake, and it takes a while to run. So I was walking through the woods, and it turns out I found these 2 wells that happen to be into the woods. I was like, hey, you know what? We can put the geophysics line here. So this is this line that goes half in the lake, half in the ground. These black lines aren't the wells. They're the actual depths to water in the well. And you can see here, again, there's outseepage at the southwest shore, and you can see resistivity here, in this case, beautifully mapped the water table gradient. So you can see it. So the stuff in red is resistive, which means it's dry, and the stuff in yellow and green is more conductive. So we can use that, again, not groundbreaking, but we can use resistivity and other geophysics methods to map groundwater tables and things like that. So that's one case here. All right, so this next thing kind of goes along with the seepage meters. And again, the issue was, can we use this electrical resistivity to say we should put seepage meters here and forget about these other spots? So this was done, again, the stuff on the left is the outwash. So again, it should be more porous. And then the stuff on the right is the till, so it should have less porosity, lower porosity. And up at the top here, we have seepage rates from 2007 and 2008. And you can see, again, in the outwash, high seepage rates, and in the till, not so high seepage rates. So here's the key thing here. Two different measurements, but a different electrode spacing. So again, you remember I said the further the electrodes are apart, the deeper you get. So the one on the top here has electrode spacing of 1 meter, and the one on the bottom has electrode spacing of ½ meter. So you lose a little bit of depth. But again, the thing that's affecting the resistivity here is the porosity. And you can see is where the porosity is low, you get a much higher resistivity. So that big red stuff on the right on both of these. And where you get more porous, you get less resistivity, kind of like in 1,000 ohm meter range. And so that happened from both years, and you can see it on both lines. And so the sort of takeaway from this is that, yes, we can say, okay, if we have this sort of setup, if you have if you have low porosity, you're going to have this high resistivity. Probably don't need to put seepage meters there. So hopefully that would guide that along. One other thing you can do with resistivity is you can lead the cable there and you can measure how it changes over time. And so what happens is you take a measurement and then you take another measurement, and that's what this first line shows here. And this isn't showing resistivity now. What we're showing is percent change from a background measurement to this one right here. And again, this is the first measurement, so I haven't moved the cable or touched anything, so yeah, there's no change. The point of this was that you remember I mentioned there was those organic fines and stuff like that. And when you walk around on the lake surface, all those organic fines float up and stuff like that. And even with the seepage meters, when you put them in, you disturb that. And the first few measurements that you take are always a little bit higher. So after that organic fine tends to settle, seepage rates go down a little bit because that stuff blocks it. Again, it's not affecting the overall seepage, but it's kind of affecting it locally over a short time. And so the point of this was that what happens if we walk around on these fines? Can we see changes in resistivity? So first one, the original measurement. B here, what happened is I just picked the cable up and put it back down. So again, you see a little bit of change, but it's typically only like 1% or 2%. So the cable landed in a different spot, whatever, so not much change. Part 3 here, though, is after I picked the cable up, walked the line, disturbed all that sediments, and then put the cable back down. And so you can see here, I have it maxed out at 6, but it was closer to like 10% change. So pretty broad change at that time. And then this last one is letting the cable sit. I can't remember the time. I think it was like an hour or 2. We let it sit and kind of let everything we were cold wait. And the percent change, again, sort of goes back to 4 or 5%. So the key take here was that, you have this organic sediment. It affects seepage a little bit locally, and if it gets disturbed, at least for an hour or 2, seepage rates can increase. And you could use time-lapse resistivity too for like tracer tests and all kinds of different things. I've used it for in the past, so it's pretty useful. All right. So kind of getting away now from my next slide here, from the groundwater surface water interaction, I thought I'd show about we can use resistivity and other geophysics methods too to map like contaminant plumes and things like that. Again, this isn't like replacing point measurements and stuff, but it's really delineating an area and making it more efficient, saying, hey, you know what, the plume is right about here, so we don't need to worry about this stuff on the outside. And in this case, this is the northeast inlet of Mirror Lake, so this is the other side. And if you were to go to that blue curtain over there, there's Interstate 93 up there. So we have this line here, and Interstate 93 kind of runs right up there. And this is New Hampshire. It's cold in the winter, so they salt this road. Oh, I have a pointer. There we go. So thank you. So they salt this road like crazy, right? And from D up to the road, there's a little stream, and you can see here clear as day. If you look at lines A and A prime and B prime, this big conductive body right here, I mean, that's the salt plume from the road coming into the lake. And all the locals around here, these people have their little vacation homes and stuff on this lake, and some people live on this lake, and they're pretty upset about the salt because it's a nice freshwater, clean lake, and they like to kayak and fish in there and stuff like that. So It's kind of an issue. They put a berm up by 93, but it didn't work. This is, the berm had been there for a couple of years, and you can still see this salt plume pretty clear as day. So this is just one specific case for, resistivity as a contaminant mapping thing. So just quick in summary, again, we can use resistivity lines, resistivity to map the water table, gradient, things like that. It seemed to work pretty well to identify broad zones of heterogeneity. So we have the high seepage zones and the low seepage zones. And again, the low seepage zones have a higher resistivity. So we can use that to sort of guide placements. Again, that's the key thing. We're just using this as a guide, not as a replacement. In this case, the organics that have been on top of the surface affected seepage locally, especially if you walked around on it. So storms would affect that, people swimming, whatever. And then again, resistivity is able to identify broad zones of contaminants, in this case salt, but L naples, D naples, all that stuff it works for. So that's it.
Great. Right before we move in to the next, we're going to take a couple quick questions, Michael, if you don't mind. That was some good information. I just wanted to make sure we didn't have any questions before we move along. Is there any questions in-house regard to information Michael presented?
Okay, I want to show of hands. Who likes science? There we go. We don't get much of it, here sometimes.
All right, let's check, see if we have anything from the web. Okay, we don't have anything. So you're off the hook, Michael.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Great job.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Dan Cook. Dan's going to talk a little bit about remedial action and how it relates to performance monitoring. So, Dan?
Right, thank you. I'm Dan Cook. I'm an ecologist with AMEC Foster Wheeler up in Somerset, New Jersey. And I'm going to be talking about, or maybe not. Oh, there you go. The performance monitoring program. After the source of contamination has been remediated, a defined program is needed to evaluate the remedy through the monitoring of groundwater, sediment, pore water, and/or surface water to ensure the remedy is operating as designed and that the remedial goals are being met. Treatment amendments can include biostimulation or bioaugmentation. This photo here is an example of a trench barrier with a bacterial slurry that's used to degrade MTBE. You can see there's a river in the background there behind the bobcat. Amendments can also include chemical oxidation reduction, air sparging, or other in situ technologies. Oh, sorry about that. Groundwater containment can include physical or hydraulic barriers to prevent or reduce discharge of surface water. These technologies have also have to consider groundwater recharge of wetlands in their monitoring programs. Permeable reactive barriers can include zero-valent iron, enhanced biological degradation, or other technologies. With permeable barriers, it's important that the hydraulic conductivity of the barrier is greater than the native aquifer to maximize flow through the barrier as opposed to around it. Monitor natural attenuation and recovery. It's not likely to be your sole remedy, but after the source has been remediated, MNA, MNR, post-remedial monitoring can be performed to evaluate the effectiveness over time.
Uh-oh, you hit the wrong button.
Oh boy, I broke it.
The left bottom left.
There you go. Sorry about that. When a remedy is implemented, a performance monitoring program must be implemented as well. The program's design should allow for sampling that's reproducible and yields a robust database for decision making. The plan must be site-specific, and it has to address sources of hydrologic, spatial, and temporal variability. It must also consider the existing and designated uses of the surface water and its classification, trout production, recreation, drinking water, as Jill mentioned earlier. Fate and transport modeling may be used to design monitoring points to determine where you're going to collect your data, but modeling is not an acceptable substitute for actual field sampling. Seasonal and short-term weather changes should be considered, and the hydrologic cycle should be viewed on a local scale appropriate to the size of your site. For example, diurnal fluctuations from evapotranspiration in the summer can impact groundwater discharge in your sites with a significant number of trees. Droughts can reduce the flow of both groundwater and surface water. Floods can rearrange bed sediments and change water flow paths, and potentially cause mass transport of chemicals. So plans should include contingencies for data collection during and immediately after extreme events. The topography and drainage areas should be evaluated, a steep-sided valley versus your lowlands, a large watershed versus a small one. The duration of flooding is largely determined by topography, and that should be factored into the design of your monitoring plan. The morphology of the stream also has to be considered. The shape of the channel, directional changes, the composition of the bed and banks, vegetation in and along the stream, the presence of floodplains, banks, bars, and the permeability of the substrate. Sand is more permeable than bedrock. These all impact groundwater discharge. Tidal variability is almost continuous, and conditions change on an hourly basis. So monitoring plans have to consider entire tide cycles in order to be representative. In urban areas, impervious surfaces produce more runoff, which is typically collected and focused at point sources. Runoff from impervious surfaces is much faster than from forested areas, and there's a much higher potential for flash floods. An additional consideration in more densely populated areas is the presence of pumping wells for residential irrigation or public water supplies. And that can significantly impact the direction and the flow of groundwater. Developing a monitoring plan. The plan should focus on the specific performance-based objectives of the remedy. This may include monitoring of groundwater elevations and groundwater quality, surface water elevations and surface water quality, sediment pore water quality, or other physical biological monitoring. The monitoring plan should focus on the overall objectives of the expected outcomes of monitoring, a complete description of the media to be sampled, groundwater, sediment, pore water, biota, sample collection locations, and collection depths should be included. The frequency of monitoring should be laid out, taking into consideration seasonal flow conditions and tide cycles. A field sampling protocol should be detailed. It should identify the analytical parameters and methods that are going to be used. The plan should determine the duration of the sampling program required to reach a decision point about whether the monitoring program needs to be increased, whether it can be decreased, or whether your remedial goals have been met. Generally, 8 quarters of data are required to discern trends, but the duration of monitoring should be site-specific. A statistical evaluation of baseline conditions pre-remedy and the expected post-remedy conditions is useful to ensure that adequate sampling is conducted to make decisions. Short-term data should allow assessment of the remedial design, whereas the longer-term data will allow for the evaluation of trends in the data and whether the design needs modification. It'll also allow decision makers to decide when the remedial goal has been reached or when monitoring can be stopped. More sampling and more frequent sampling is typically necessary during the initial phases of post-remedial monitoring to determine the hydraulic conditions, contaminant trends, and the effectiveness of the remedy. Once the remedy has been shown to be operating successfully, less frequent monitoring may be appropriate. If monitored natural recovery is part of the remedy, the plan has to include long-term monitoring endpoints that depend on natural recovery. If the remedy includes sediment burial, the plan should include monitoring of deposition and erosion. If the risk driver is human consumption of fish or shellfish, periodic tissue analysis may be needed. If the risk driver is surface water contamination, periodic surface water sampling at high and low flow during and after storm events is needed. If the risk driver is pore water, again, periodic pore water sampling is needed. And as with any monitoring plan, the site conditions change. It may also be necessary to modify your monitoring plan. And that's all I got.
Thank you very much, Dan. Just in the consideration of time, we're going to move right into the next and last presentation, and then we'll take questions after that to close out the session. So up next, we have a repeat performance by Scott Drew, who's going to talk a little bit about some case studies in regard to mitigation. So, Scott?
Thanks. Yes, I'm the last thing between you and lunch, so I'll try to make this quick. frankly, when we went through the dry run last Friday, I thought there was no way we were going to finish this on time, and we seem to be doing pretty well. So we're moving on to Chapter 7, the last chapter of the guidance document, and looking at the application of either mitigation or remediation technologies to mitigate the discharge to a environmentally sensitive natural resource. So at this point, you've already determined that there is a discharge. You have a conceptual site model. You have figured out where that discharge is going by looking at temperature or other types of sampling techniques, and it's time to apply a technology to mitigate or stop that discharge. So just to reiterate what Dan said a minute ago, there's a number of remedial strategies that are mentioned in the guidance document. You can break them into these three general groupings, I think. One is technologies that treat the groundwater prior to discharge. Examples would be biostimulation, bioaugmentation, air sparging, chemical oxidation or reduction, and so forth. The second would be the application of permeable reactive barriers, so designed to encourage the flow of the contaminated groundwater into an area where there's either sorption or reaction that degrades those compounds. And the last would be groundwater containment, where things like sheet pile or slurry walls are used for preventing the discharge, usually keyed into an aquitard, and often used in conjunction with hydraulic control, pumping and treating of groundwater. You know, as I was sitting over there, I thought there was one other technology that probably ought to be set in here, and that is use of phytoremediation. The USGS has done a lot of work with planting of trees along the pathway for discharge. Actually is more of a hydraulic control than anything else because it's sorbing water and preventing that flow into the resource. So recall that one of the tech rules at 726E 5.1D requires that any remedial technology not in itself provide any additional damage to a natural resource. So in applying any one of these technologies, you also have to think about what sort of impact it may have on that receptor. And as Dan mentioned, in addition to these, monitored natural attenuation might be something that you want to consider. If you go to the M&A guidance document, one of the general conditions that could prevent you from applying M&A is an impact to a receptor. And certainly in this case, that might be a reason enough to not use M&A as a sole remedial or mitigative technology. However, there is a lot of very interesting research going on now that's looking at the degradation of compounds, particularly in sediments, and that work might be important to look at essentially a monitored natural attenuation approach as part of your remedial strategy. Certainly you would still have to look at source control in the way that monitored natural attenuation always requires. So here's a couple of case studies. Neither of these sites are in New Jersey. And let me first say that I'm indebted to my colleague, Dr. James Wang, for the information on this first site, an MGP site, where there was a discharge of groundwater to a tidal river. And then in the second case study, when I get to that, I'm indebted to Dr. Dwayne Graves, another colleague of mine at Geosyntec, who was involved in this very interesting study performed by the USGS. So looking at this first case, this is a former MGP site in a highly developed area. There was actually a development of expensive office condominiums on top of the former MGP site, and that gave very limited opportunity to directly address contaminants that remained in the subsurface. The area is composed of filled wetlands, which also might be typical of New Jersey, of course. Oftentimes, you don't need to do a lot of work to find out where the discharge point is because you have visible seeps or staining on the groundwater or on the surface water body as a result of the discharge, and that certainly was the case in this particular case study. We saw seeps and odors that were noticed at low tide, and staining sheens was visible at high tides. And another feature here that I think is important for all of you to consider when you're going through your conceptual site model is the potential for preferential pathways. In this case, it was found that a storm sewer that was running from the, generally from the area where the source area was to the surface water body was acting as a conduit for delivery of that or transport of that material from the source area to the surface water body. And it happened in two ways. One, there was discharge of groundwater directly into the storm sewer, so it was being transported directly. And there was also preferential flow pathways through the bedding material, through the backfill that was placed when the storm sewer was put into place. So, so watch for that. It's not atypical, particularly in New Jersey. So the contaminants that we were looking at were, the compounds of interest were typical of an MGP site. We're looking at volatile organic compounds, benzene, toluene, xylenes. Also looking at naphthalene and PAHs. There was also intermittent discharge of LNAPL, generally tied to storm events when the water table would rise, lift that material into the more permeable material around the storm sewer, and then it would transport down to the surface water body. So that was another issue that we had to account for in developing the remedial strategy here. So again, there was little opportunity to address the source area directly because of the development. The storm sewer is actually placed underneath a roadway, and you know, the mitigation technique became interrupting that pathway for discharge. So the primary technology used here was biosparging, aerobic bioremediation of these compounds. A pre-designed pilot study was held. We looked at radius of influence and the development of dissolved oxygen in the subsurface. One other aspect about this was that we were able to show that biosparging was appropriate without doing any kind of air emissions control. There wasn't a need for a vapor extraction system in the subsurface to collect vapors that were being issued from the air sparging. So again, one other aspect of this, because it's a highly developed site, there were limited opportunities for installing infrastructure, for installing large equipment installations. In fact, the original remedy suggested for the site was a pump and treat system. Literally was not a lot of area for setting up a that type of system. So being able to install this remedy below ground with a minimal amount of infrastructure was important. So, whoops, we're on to a question.
Here we go for the last one. And this is for the webinar audience again. Please pay attention. We do have a question for you, and I would take this opportunity to remind the in-house audience of their training evaluation form. If you guys could pull that out, make sure you fill that out. Tessie will tackle anyone who tries to get out of the door without filling that out. That's what you told me, right? She will. Anthony, can we make that active for the webinar audience? Here we go. So we're going to ask the in-house audience, because they've been really excellent in answering these questions. I've been thoroughly stunned and amazed at the amount of intelligence just in this one collective room. So this question is, in this case study that's being presented, a pre-designed study was performed to determine the effective radius of, because we can't quite see it. How many people think that is true? Okay, how many think that is false? You guys are amazing. You guys on the webinar, you should be in this room because it is pretty stunning. These guys are very good. We have 24 seconds into it. We have 72% voted. To remind the webinar audience, if you do not answer 3 out of the 4 questions, there's always someone who's had 6 cups of coffee and has a pressing need to be away from their computer, and we realize that, which is why you only have to answer 3 out of the 4. But make sure that you do answer 3 out of the 4, or you cannot be eligible for CECs. So we are up to 15 seconds left. 83% have logged in. Make that 84. You guys are good. Just in case, now that we can see, it was the radius of influence. I made the question. I didn't even know what it was. So 1 minute, you can close that down. We're good. Thank you so much. And as soon as Anthony clicks back on it, we'll be able to move forward. So thank you, Scott. There we go.
Okay, great. Back to the pilot study. And again, this is typical of a air sparging or biosparging pilot study. The chart on your left, my right, is showing the increase in dissolved oxygen in the saturated zone and ORP as a result of the injection of air with time. And the diagram or figure on the right shows the calculation of radius of influence based on measurement of these parameters and using different flow injection rates and so forth. So this information was used to design the full-scale installation. Also, I should mention for biosparging, it's important that, particularly in this case, that it's not run continuously, because you can actually set up a hydraulic barrier by mixing air and water on a continual basis. And obviously that might discourage the contaminated water from going through your treatment zone. So generally intermittent injection of air is used. In addition, there were a couple other things that we needed to deal with. One was the LNAPL issue, and this was actually upgradient of the air sparging system. A seal was placed around the, it's actually plan view on the top. A seal was placed around the stormwater pipe to prevent movement along that bedding zone. The area was backfilled with more permeable material, and again, this is near the top of the water table. And using some piping, water was encouraged to flow into an oil water separator that is actually installed in situ, and then water flows out of that, leaving the LNAPL behind. And again, that can be maintained on a regular basis where LNAPL can be removed. And then on the down gradient end, also dealing with this issue of potential for LNAPL to travel past the pipe or along the pipe. There was a reactive barrier installed. In this case, there were seals placed above and below the pipe, and then an area where an organoclay and activated carbon media was used. And again, water flow is encouraged through that area, and contaminants could be sorbed by that material. It's interesting because there was limited space here to place a fairly thick reactive barrier, and so this is designed with media that's in baskets that can be removed and replaced as it is expended. So this system was installed in 2013 and is operating as designed. And again, typical of other types of remedial strategies, mitigation of a discharge is really the first step towards a plan to remediate the sediments. Of course, you want to remove that potential for recontaminating material if you're dredging sediments and then replacing them with other material. So here's another case study. This is a fairly important piece of work done by the USGS and a number of other collaborators. The project was managed by Drs. Emily Major and Michelle Laura. Co-authors were Dan Phelan and Angela McGinty. And the USGS was supported by the Environmental Management Division of Aberdeen Proving Ground, Geosyntec, and also EA Science and Technology. And this report is actually a fascinating report, very detailed. Gets into a lot of issues on sampling, how samples are obtained in various positions throughout the subsurface in a reproducible way, and also brings up issues with analysis of those samples and so forth. But anyway, this report is cited in the guidance document, and it's very well worth reading. So here's the issue. It involves the West Canal Creek, which is a surface water body that winds through the outer parts of Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Because of former discharge practices, there were chlorinated solvents in the groundwater, and it was found that there were discharges of groundwater to the surface water body. And in particular, there were areas where there were groundwater seeps, where larger volumes of water were discharging in a discrete zone. And even though those might represent a relatively small fraction of the total groundwater discharged into the water body, they were found to contain a much higher percentage of the contaminants being discharged to the surface water body. So an important point of discharge in terms of impact. The other issue here is there are a variety of chlorinated solvents involved. We have both chlorinated ethanes, in particular tetrachloroethane, or TECA as it's shown here. We have chlorinated ethenes, TCE and PCE were part of it. We also have chlorinated methanes, carbon tetrachloride, chloroform, dichloromethane, chloromethane, and so forth. So this variety of contaminants leads to a situation where you need a variety of microbial and even abiotic technologies to try to take care of all these compounds at once. Flow is actually from an underlying sand and gravel aquifer that is relatively aerobic. So this vertical gradient up through the sediments, particularly in the seep areas, was not establishing a lot of treatment for these particular compounds. However, it was noticed that in other areas where the flow was not quite as rapid, there was fairly effective natural attenuation by the bacteria or the cultures that were available in that media. So as John said, the first step is to try to find the discharge point. This is a aerial IR photograph, the black and white photograph in the middle, clearly showing one of these seeps based on thermal differences. Because this is a military base, access to aircraft, I guess, was fairly easy, although a number of us speculated that particularly people who would like to have new toys, using a drone for this work would be kind of fun. So perhaps that's something you could talk to people about. But at any rate, so the seep was clearly identified. The charts on the left-hand side show the molar concentration of contaminants in the with depth in the sediments around the seep area, and clearly show where treatment is required. So here's the concept: a bioreactive mat, the actual construction of an area that would allow a number of different things. First of all, from a treatment standpoint, you want to maximize the degradation of VOCs that are discharging this particular area. You want to maximize the efficiency of those microbes. You want to give them an environment where they can live and thrive and reproduce and so forth over a long period of time. But finally, you also need to consider the geotechnical issues. You want to maintain that vertical gradient. You want to make sure the water is passing through the mat and not being directed off into other particular areas. You also want to make sure that the mat stays in place. You don't want it washing away. So all these types of issues were, came into play during this development. First of all, looking at degradation by native cultures, the USGS worked at isolating the cultures that were responsible for this activity, and then once they developed this mixed culture, they used serum labs to develop it to high concentrations where it could be reapplied into the biomat. I swear to you, I knew about this project for a long period of time, and it only hit me in the last couple of days that WBC2 means West Branch of Canal Creek. I thought it was something else, but at any rate, this is a mixed culture that was isolated from the site and then reapplied in the site. So there was some in situ treatability work done, comparing the activity of bio-augmented and non-bio-augmented areas. You can see, actually John mentioned the peeper type sampler in the lower right-hand side. That is another type of sampling device using that same approach. Vials of clean water with a permeable membrane are placed inside that slotted screen and then driven down into the sediment, allowed to sit for a couple of weeks to equilibrate, and then are analyzed for VOCs. So again, the pilot study was performed to evaluate the potential for bioaugmentation in the area. And so here are some of the results. First of all, some of this pilot study work allowed the calculation or modeling of the performance of the culture with various thicknesses of the mat, and that's shown in the upper right-hand side. At the same time, the geotechnical properties of the mat were also modeled. Again, a lot of this work is also coming out of or being dealt with directly with things like sediment capping and so forth, where you need to make sure that if you place a cap in a particular area, it's going to stay in place. It's going to be rugged in terms of erosion and other types of things. And so, the types of techniques that were used here are applicable on a larger scale with a variety of different technologies. And again, I mentioned that there was an amazing amount of data collected at this site. Samplers were placed in a variety of different points in the mat, and it's a very strong data set. So here's just a conceptual picture of what this design looks like. Again, you have a hydraulic gradient that's vertical, water is flowing up through it. The overall mat is about 12 by 13 feet. It's actually about 22 inches thick. So sediment was extracted from the site or excavated from the site, and then the mat was constructed using non-woven geotechnical material, and then the installation of the materials for the mat. So in the lower zone, there's a mixture of sand to maintain permeability, peat material, and compost. Actually, I was told that the compost here was from blue crabs, which I don't know if any of you have been around composted fish material, but the odor is quite impressive. I'm sure you won't forget it. Also, chitin as a long-term source of electron donor material to support anaerobic biological activity, and also zero-valent iron. Iron was added here as a way to try to abionically catalyze the degradation of some of the, particularly the chlorinated methanes, to give it an extra boost. And then in the upper layer, there's sand, peat, compost again, more chitin material, and the actual reapplied culture, the bioaugmented culture on the top. And finally, some pea gravel on top to keep it in place. So it's about 22 inches thick, about 12 by 13 in dimension. So here's just some pictures of what this looks like. The initial site preparation involved putting some staging around it so that people could walk around it and access the area. Sediment was removed with the vac truck, and then the material was placed inside this. The culture was added to it, and so you can see it in place. Actually, the start of the experiment, October 2004. The shoring was removed from around it, and then you can see a picture of what it actually looks like in May of 2005. You can see various sampling devices placed inside it. So here's just some pictures of results, again with depth below the mat and up into the mat. And you can see the degradation, the very effective degradation of chlorinated solvents. This is actually molar concentration, which is very helpful when you are looking at biological pathways, not so helpful when you're complying with regulations. But in general, you're running from ppm levels on the right-hand side of that chart to low ppb levels on the left-hand side of the chart. Another thing to track is the generation of the final end products of biodegradation, particularly ethane coming from chlorinated ethenes. And you can look at the ethene measured in the subsurface below the mat, into the mat, and through the mat. You can also look at ethane, same sort of thing. And finally, methane being generated in the mat, showing that it's active. So here's a look at mass removal. And you can see that there's a very high level of removal in the mat. You might note that the levels of removal dropped slightly in March. That also showed up in the data regarding generation of gases. The reason for that, colder temperatures in the winter. But again, pretty effective removal through this strategy. And just some conclusions from that. Actually, I think a very successful and very elegant demonstration of a concept into a final remedy. I'm told the mat is still in place, and actually some of the native vegetation has grown back in over it. So it is even less intrusive than before. No adverse effects to surface water quality by measurements, and over time, minimal settlement of materials, and it's very stable in the environment. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. Excellent job. We just want to recognize we are about 10 minutes over. We apologize for that. It's kind of tough to schedule these things and make it come out exactly to where you want it to be. So we will not be insulted if either the webinar audience or people in-house need to leave, but we will be taking questions right now, and you're welcome to stay while we do that. So any questions in-house for any of the last two presenters? We see none in-house. Anthony, can you just open it up to outside and see if there's any questions? There is. There was a question on the EPA passive sampling guidance that was mentioned. What was the website again? I think if you just search for CERDIP, which is, yes, I'm not sure how we will get that link forwarded to us, and then we'll post it on the training page. But it's SRDP, I think, SERDP, and that again is a compilation of EPA, DOD, and DOE. Right. Okay. Another question is the answers to questions were not provided to webinar participants. Not sure what that means. I thought we did. Any information on typical costs for doing a groundwater to surface water investigation and remediation? I know there are no typical projects. For example, how much would the Aberdeen project have cost if it was done in the private sector? So Scott, do we have any ideas on that? Let me grab you a mic here.
I'd say that because it was a research project, it's probably not something you want to compare for commercial application, but certainly you could streamline it to other,
okay.
Other
and each one I'm sure is different in regard to scope and intricacies, so okay. Let's take one more. Does the mat have an expiration? So Scott, on that particular case, does the mat have an expiration?
As far as I know, it's still active. I'm not sure if there's any recent data on it, but it seems to be continuing to function as designed.
Right. Now, I would imagine it's designed for to meet at least a certain time-specific effectiveness, and then after that, whether it remains effective is not that critical. Another one. What were the answers to the quiz questions? Oh, that's what they're talking about. You guys can't have the answers to the quiz questions. But I would have to say, if you couldn't figure them out, I'm a little bit nervous about the LSRPs that are taking the webinar quizzes. Everyone in the room figured them out. We didn't give them the answers, right? So we can't let you guys in the webinar have all the answers to the questions. So I think that is it. I thank you guys so much for attending this particular training course. Please sign out. Make sure that you sign out. And for the training evaluations, we would certainly appreciate your help in providing feedback. For the webinar participants, you are welcome to email your training evaluation responses to me, George Nicholas. My email address is on the opening slide. And with that, I thank you guys so much and have a great afternoon. John, great job. We'll see you. Thanks, Jill. How are you? Good. Sorry you didn't announce the error. John, good job.